For a long time now, young earth creationists have been pretty well getting by with what I view as a very poor and frankly very self-righteous argument, which is namely this, that anyone who believes in an old earth is somehow blaming God, as they would say, for suffering and death in the animal kingdom. According to young earth creationists, all death is a result of the fall of man. Originally, God didn't intend for anything really to die. I mean, they might equivocate on insects and plants and that sort of thing. But animals, bunny rabbits, cats, dogs, tigers, that sort of thing, these animals were supposedly as immortal as they believe man was before the fall. These animals were not intended to die. Only when Adam sinned did death enter all of creation, including the animal world. And they stand by this, arguing that God's original design was perfect and included no death whatsoever. No death is man's fault. Now, folks, very quickly here, I want to challenge you to think about some things where this is concerned, okay? If death comes into the creation as a result of a curse, which is what Genesis chapter 3 tells us, God curses man and subjects man to death, then death did not enter as some force of nature like gravity or electromagnetism. No, it entered as a direct result of the curse of God. In other words, God chose to introduce it. God chose to respond to the fall of man with death. And for some reason, according to young earth creationists, this is inevitable, God also chose to penalize animals who had not sinned for the sin of Adam. So animals didn't do anything wrong, but God decides somehow they need to suffer and die too. So he extends the curse to them, and now death also prevails upon animals. This is a problem for me personally. I see no justice in it, and I know people are going to respond to me, "Who are you, O man, to say unto the Creator, whatever, blah, blah, blah." Fact of the matter is, it makes no sense that God would curse animals for something that man did. Okay? That's the first thing that you need to consider. Why on earth would God do such a thing? The other thing is this. According to young earth creationist assumptions here, who created the animals? God did, right? Who gave animals their physical characteristics, including the teeth and claws that they use to prey upon one another, to fight with one another in battles for domination and turf and all that sort of thing, and to kill and maim? God gave them those things. Who gave them the instinct to use those weapons that they have, the teeth, the claws, etc.? God did that. Now, if they kill and maim and fight one another and devour one another, it can only be because God has given them the ability to do it, he's given them the instinct to do it, and he has prompted them in some way to do it. Again, God chose to introduce death to the animal world as a result of Adam's fall. God cursed them, just like he cursed man, with the result that animals now do these things, okay? So inevitably, all of this is God's choice in young earth creationist theology. God decided that animals would do these things, and he equipped them to do these things, and then somehow prompted them after the fall to go ahead and start doing those things to one another. He equipped them even before the fall. And some young earth creationists will say that God gave them these abilities because he knew they would need them in a cursed creation after the fall. Well, who cursed creation? God did. Who decided what that curse would look like? God did. So God, no matter how you look at it, God decided that animals would suffer and die as they do today. He gave them the abilities, the physical characteristics, and the instincts to do what they do to one another. And when you think about it, animals in that way suffer even worse than we do. Why do animals suffer worse than mankind? I mean, God did not curse us to say, now you will fight and devour and destroy one another and tear each other up and eat each other literally. No, we didn't do that. We just inherited, supposedly, according to some theology, this sin nature that corrupts us and makes us do terrible things to one another. And God cursed us directly with death. We ultimately physically die. But when it comes to animals, God went over and above merely introducing death. He could have set things up so that animals just die naturally. They age, they contract diseases, and they die of those things, but they would otherwise be harmless towards themselves and towards humans. He didn't have to introduce what we call nature red in tooth and claw, this aspect of the natural world that young earth creationists say they are so appalled by and lay at the feet of man's sin. No. God decided what would happen as a result of man's sin. God equipped animals in every way, physically and instinctively, to do what they do to one another and to human beings as well. God set all of this in motion. God decided to curse them. So no matter how you look at it, inevitably, according to young earth creationist theology, God is responsible for nature red in tooth and claw. This was a deliberate decision on God's part, not just death, but suffering and everything else, predation, all of it that we see in the animal kingdom. God deliberately chose to introduce those things. So is that blaming God? You could argue that God has some reason. Old earth believers do believe that God has reasons for these things. And we can speculate on that. That's not the point here. We do have possible reasons for that. I've got a series of videos that look into that. I'll link below in the discussion notes. Young earth creationists, though, I really don't see any way out for you here. You have got to confront the fact that God deliberately chose to introduce nature red in tooth and claw as a result of man's sin when he didn't have to do that. Again, he could have just let animals die, but no, he decided they would prey upon one another and they would murder one another, if you want to say it that way. They would kill, they would fight for dominance, fight for leadership of the pack, whatever else. They would do these things. God decided all of that and deliberately set it into motion. So if you want to say that's blaming God, however, he is ultimately responsible for it. You cannot get around that. And it doesn't seem necessary. Again, old earthers can give you reasons. God uses predation to control animal populations and that sort of thing, keep them from getting out of control. Overpopulation, which leads to all sorts of issues, including suffering in herbivores and animals like that. Predators actually act beneficially. And that's one aspect of it. But when it comes to the sin of man, under young earth creationist theological assumptions, I can't see any reason for it other than what almost appears to be vindictiveness. It's like God is almost striking out at everything, saying, man screwed up, now everything's going to suffer. And young earth creationists believe that the entire cosmos, the whole universe, is cursed. Every grain of dust on every planet in every galaxy, billions of light years away from us, all cursed because Adam and Eve screwed up. It seems just a tad excessive, but this is the theological implication of young earth creationism, and I'm afraid they've been running from that for far too long. Young earth creationists need to face the fact that nature red in tooth and claw was God's decision. He did not have to do it. He didn't even have to introduce death, as a matter of fact, as a consequence of man's sin. And you believe that he didn't introduce it just to man. No, he cursed animals to die too for some reason. These are aspects of your theology that you're really going to have to work out. Yes, man sinned, but God determined the judgment. God determined the outcome of that sin. Man does not, by himself, have the power to just reorder creation, and man's consequences just can't upset God's entire created order. No, God himself decided what the outcome of the situation would be. So you're going to have to stop saying man's sin is responsible for nature red in tooth and claw. No, God's decision is responsible for that. God's response to man's sin has determined that particular outcome. That is an inescapable consequence of your theology.